Hello, welcome to the Leadership Happy Hour Talk Show. I'll be your host, Victor Vogel, for the next 45 minutes. Our topic is simple. How do we improve leadership? And what we want to hear from are people who are basically followers, hourly employees, and those kinds of individuals, although we don't want to limit the show to just that. We want leaders also, or anybody else who wants to jump in and contribute. Now, we do have a couple of rules. I thought I'd go over the rules real quick. One, this is not the place to present any grievances. It's not the format. There are plenty of formats out there for that. This isn't one of them. This is a helping format, and we're really looking for simply behaviors that we can provide people who are listening to us or watching this YouTube video and show them the behaviors that actually inspire people to follow leaders. And sometimes we'll be presenting behaviors that don't inspire people to follow leaders. So both of those can be helpful to a leader who's trying to improve their leadership style or their leadership behavior. Of course, the second rule is we really don't want to name any specific companies or any specific leaders or anybody like that. So when you're thinking of somebody or you're thinking about a company or a situation, try to refrain from putting any names to those events. And outside of that, it's just a matter of you chiming in here with me and us enjoying a talk show where you have an opportunity to impact leadership. And then the last, 10 or 12 minutes or the 15 minutes of the show, maybe even, depending on how the chatting's going, I'm going to give you some pointers that I have developed and used and found out were helpful in helping leaders to improve themselves over the years. So that's generally the outline of the show. So today's question that we want to address, or the topic area that we want to address that allows you to do some chatting about leadership would be what inspires you to follow a leader? In other words, what I'd like you to do is thinking about a leader who you really enjoyed working for, somebody who got you excited about doing your job and maybe even exceeding in your job. And what were those behaviors of that leader that you can tell us that would help us understand how that leader got you excited and got you to do your work effectively, or you can think about a leader who didn't get you there, that caused you not to be inspired. You may have had to work there for some reason, but you weren't inspired. You weren't enjoying it. You weren't working at your maximum peak and looking for an ongoing continued improvement and things like that. And so those behaviors would be interesting to know too. So that's the question that's out there. And as we get viewers, we will try to take the chats and respond to them. What I would like to see, or if you're watching this or observing this, you can go to my YouTube channel, Victor L. Vogel, or you can go on that YouTube channel and it should be live, and you can click right there on the live button there and come join us and talk with us in that area. Now, or you can sit back and watch, but the problem is it's not going to be very participatory, and that this is trying to be a participatory program. So if there are some folks out there who really think they have some insight that can help leaders be better. Now, why would I do this program? So, I'll talk a little bit about the program and what can happen, because first programs hardly ever get many people, if any people, joining them on a live talk show, particularly if you haven't invested a lot of money in advertising. Since everything I'm really producing here is free, I don't spend any money for advertising. I don't have that money to spend for advertising. However, what I am providing you is my experience of 35 years in multi-billion international multi-billion dollar corporations that operate both domestically and internationally, and also companies that are independent individuals who operate businesses as like an entrepreneur, all the way up to thousands of employees scattered around the world. So I've had a vast amount of experience working with leaders. I have spent most of my career taking the time to find quality people, help them to improve themselves and sustain their business activity over a period of time. Had quite a bit of success with that. I've also had some failures, and I'll be glad to discuss the failures too as people hop on board here and decide, they want to contribute. During this period of time, what I found is most companies, and actually there's some promos. You can go back on my channel and look under the Leadership Happy Hour promo segment, and you're going to find some promos that actually show that companies spend the vast majority of their training dollars in leadership on senior leadership. And the concept here is, if I train my senior leaders, they will in turn turn around and promote that down through the organization and transfer it down into the organization. And, anybody that's worked in an American company, well, not just American company, but most companies, they know they're hierarchical. And so that chain of command creates a whole host of issues that can block that transference of knowledge down throughout the ranks. So consequently, you have a large segment of dollars being spent on leadership. And think about this. I'll try to lay this out as concretely as I can for you while we're waiting on people to come on board, if they come on board. If not, this will be more of a training program. I'll try to lay this out. What happens is, let's say there's billions of dollars spent every year on training. And what we know from that is the vast majority of it goes to senior leaderships. Now, we also know, for example, that the vast majority of money spent on leadership training and development is spent by larger corporations. And then it drops off significantly for mid-level and almost nothing for smaller companies. They can't afford it, or they can't afford people to be away from it, or the leadership is more family-based as opposed to hierarchical structured leadership. So already we began to ask ourselves a question, and all of this money, billions and billions of dollars every year being spent on leadership, why don't we have better leadership to draw on out there from the world? We don't have to look any further than our government right now to see that leadership is weak. Okay, it's not strong at all. And when you look at that, you have to ask, but we spend billions of dollars developing leaders all over this country. Where are they? What are they doing? Well, they're back in companies for one thing, but you have to remember that the vast majority of those $1 billion are spent by a fewer amount of companies because they're large. The larger companies are fewer. The vast majorities of businesses in this country are medium to small businesses. They're not large businesses. So large businesses do the largest amount of training for leadership, and they only train, or they don't only train, but for the most part they train their senior leaders, which is a smaller subset of the whole leadership program for a corporation. So we have fewer people being trained than, we're spending more on leadership training, but fewer and fewer people being trained. And so consequently, you assume, as people want to step into more powerful leadership roles and assume more and more responsibility, you're hoping that those people are evolving and getting better and better at what they're doing, but it doesn't seem to be the case. More importantly, you don't have that trickle-down effect that corporations think happens is not happening like it should happen. So consequently, all the mid-level managers in those big corporations and any mid-level managers or any, leaders in smaller businesses, they're not using that money that they spend on learning about leadership. They're not using that leadership learning to enhance the rest of the organization or themselves very effectively. So therein lies the whole problem with the training thing. And I think people, I can remember that about the only way you could get somebody to attend a training program was to hold it in like Las Vegas or San Francisco or Orlando or Paris or London or Amsterdam or, Beijing or Hong Kong or, Brisbane or places that were larger entertainment centers. And entertainment was part of that training package. If you wanted a leader to come to your session, if you had what you thought was a pretty good session, that you would do two things. You put a fairly high price on it, but you would put it in a place like Las Vegas. And that's why people would, be really excited about spending quite a bit of money on training. So, leadership doesn't necessarily get enhanced with all this training that's going on. And how do I know that? It's pretty simple. I learned very early on as a consultant. Well, first of all, even working within corporations, and I worked in some significant corporations that were considered highly successful. But as a consultant, it really rang clear to me when I had to go into an organization that was struggling with performance, and you could see it in the people arena, the culture of the company, and my job was to go in and sort of assess that and help them understand what they needed to do to make the changes. And so what happened was I began to see the lack of true leadership, because I saw that leaders really didn't understand the purpose of leadership. If you went in and looked on a performance appraisal for leader in organizations, you didn't see things like inspired employees on the mark. You saw them hitting their financial goals, you saw them hitting their production goals or whatever those might be from the business standpoint. When it got down to the people who they led, those results tended to be focused on things like, lower turnover percentages. Okay. Now, obviously, to get higher production goals, you had to get people doing things. But, you can get higher production goals by firing people continuously and bringing new people on board. Of course, that's a costly way to do it, but you can get it to happen that way. And so what I found was, first of all, leaders really didn't understand what their product was. If you think of leadership and try to think, what is my product as a leader? Not a manager of a department, not a leader of a department, but a leader, somebody who has to inspire other people to accomplish things in order for that department or that company to move forward. The leadership product is actually inspired and motivated employees. That's the product of leadership. And leaders, when I used to go into organizations that were struggling, they had no concept of this. It was not something they looked at on a regular basis. So it became clear to me that if I wanted to understand whether a leader was successful, I didn't need to talk to the leader. I didn't need to talk to the leader's bosses. I didn't even need to talk to their customers. The best source of how a leader was doing was the employee or the follower of that leader, whether it was an employee, supervisor, whatever, but someone who was subordinate to that leader, who that leader was trying to lead in terms of what they needed them to achieve in the organization. And it was at that point when I started recognizing that information, and I would go down and collect that information. Now, there are some things that you can go do. You can do surveys, and you can do other things that are pretty valid surveys. You know, I use some very valid surveys to assess the culture, and I would tie what people were saying about their leaders back to the overall company culture. But that was down the road. The first thing was, how can I get that leader who doesn't seem to have employees wanting to perform effectively turned around in a way that would inspire those employees to perform effectively? That was what was exciting. That's what needed to happen in the world out there, and particularly in the leadership world. And if you think about what's going on with the president in the White House right now, do you think you have inspired employees inside that White House? Everything that we hear that's coming out of that White House shows that they're not inspired. In fact, it's worse than that. They're afraid. They live in fear. And that's what a poor leader does. They lead through fear. And we'll see that when we talk in a few minutes about some of the concepts that I use that are pretty valid concepts I've learned over the years. There are certain things you can rest on that are pretty valid, and when you hold somebody up against those, it helps you glean their behavior and assess it a little more effectively. And then there are things that people write out there that aren't. And then so as we go through this process, this is what I am trying to do with this show. I am trying to get people who live day in and day out under a boss and talk on this show, just describe on this show the kinds of behaviors that make a leader inspire you to want to excel at what he would like you to do and you need to do in your job. So people will work at a job because they need money. They won't necessarily work in their job to make that company more successful. They may not feel they have any chance of making that happen because of how the leader treats them. So, this is where it all begins, where you try to get some input from people who have bosses who can tell other people, hey, this is the kind of thing that will get me wanting to follow you and to perform for you and to be exceptionally good for you as a leader. And what leaders recognized that were successful in making the turn for me was the leader who basically stopped taking credit and recognized that really everything that happened by that workforce that they were leading. So that when you step out of that workforce and you step into a leader role, or you step out of college into a leader role, maybe you haven't even worked yet, you need to understand your role as a leader is not a credit role. It's like special operations groups. They don't take credit for what they do, but they do some pretty phenomenal things for us out there. But you don't hear about it. You don't hear about it because it's confidential, but those aren't the kind of guys who want you to know or brag about what they're doing. They just recognize it's good. So there are a lot of characteristics in this that will pop up and we'll talk about that will basically make you understand what the role of a leader really is. Now, outside of, these things that inspire people, within that context, there's so many other things we have to talk about. And we'll get into those. One of those is ethics and morality. And when that's void, no matter what you come up with to be an effective leader, you're not going to be very effective. You may get something achieved, but it's not going to be the kind of stuff that takes the organization or the people in the environment you're leading to the next higher plane. It's not going to be the kind of thing that sustains, and in the long run often are the kinds of things that get you hung up and take you backwards. Okay, and we've had some incidents just recently of people who were phenomenal. They were exciting, the ideas were exciting, people were excited about it, but just kind of fizzled all of a sudden. One of those companies was Uber. And the CEO of Uber, who basically was ousted out of his own company. The company's under a tremendous amount of litigation. They find it more and more difficult to be competitive now with something that they innovated and created. Now, Uber was the spearhead of this. Lyft and all these other companies came in behind it. Uber, that CEO was the mindset. But the way he did it, the way he led, the ethics and morality of his leading was his downfall. So there's a real good example of, the fact that you can lead in this world, and you still can get things done doing it, leading poorly. Being a poor leader, you can still get things done. You can achieve things, and you will have followers who will follow you. Unfortunately, they will begin to dwindle. They will begin to see the truth. They hope for something that will change. But and then they keep hoping, because even though they may have made a mistake putting their faith in the leader, they still hope that change can happen, and that from some miracle it will happen. And some of it may inch along enough to keep them believing, but eventually it will all falter. So leadership is a very delicate process, so ethics and morality are part of it. The concept of what's going on all around you in the world and how that's changing, all the dynamics that are associated with our changing world impacts leadership. So you really have to have a good set of values and core values and a good culture about your leadership style to sustain the onslaught of everything that's going to try to pressure you and change you out of that realm that you know is the most successful thing you can do as a leader. So culture is one issue. Ethics and morality is a topic area. It'd be great to discuss. Actually, this whole concept of, roles the leader play, is, and I think I have a good example of this, I think. I think we have a leader in General Kelly, who was an outstanding military leader in all forms that you can measure as a leader. His troops liked him, the people who he reported to liked him, Congress liked him, everybody liked General Kelly, and they liked his leadership style, and they liked what he did for this country. And then he chose to become an administrator under Donald Trump. And you have seen him fall from grace consistently. Now, some theories I have about that is that there are roles that leaders play. And you really need to be clear about your strengths and weaknesses and your desires or likes and assuming certain leadership positions because of the roles they require of you. Some require a more directive and straightforward, aggressive approach, and others require a very subtle, influential approach. So there's some different roles that leaders play, and we're going to talk about that in upcoming shows too as we start the process. And it's kind of, hopefully people will be talking about, again, how they're inspired relative to each of these topic areas that we're going to be covering. So next time we'll probably be talking about ethics and morality next week, and we want to know the kinds of things about ethics and about morality that sustain your trust and your commitment to a leader. That's what we'll talk about next week. But this week we're just trying to set the base rules about what are the behaviors. Now, how would you recognize the behavior? It's pretty simple. Behaviors aren't things like he's a nice guy. Nice guy does not tell a leader anything that will help them develop themselves. Whether they're not seen as a nice guy, that nice guy word or those two words really don't tell the leader very much about what they need to do to improve or what they need to do to continue moving forward. So behaviors are concrete things. So let me chat one behavior out here for you that an inspired leader ran a significant corporation in America that's sustained over 50 plus years and is doing great. I'm going to type this out. He is always taking the time to walk and talk with all employees. And I'm talking about a CEO when I'm thinking here of this person. Okay, think about that. This is a behavior. I can see this. I can observe this. So if I happen to be in this environment where this leader is the CEO of, when he comes and visits me someplace that isn't his headquarters, I'm probably going to see him. I'm probably going to get a chance to say something to him. He's probably going to talk to me. And I can tell you this, even 20 years later when I saw him again in his cafeteria, he recognized me from when I worked for him before. So think about that. That's a behavior. That's an actual kind of behavior. If you have a CEO who is the opposite of that, someone who stays in the office all the time, doesn't get out into the field and see what's going on, doesn't talk with employees, doesn't get ideas from employees, and doesn't help those employees contribute, you probably have someone who really doesn't have their pulse and handle. And I'm guessing most employees I talked to when I was with this company for a few years, they would always tell me they enjoyed and looked forward to this CEO coming. And they were all committed to doing whatever it took to hit that value system. I will tell you, since that person has left, that corporation isn't as professional and isn't as energized at hitting the high-end goals and the high-end customer treatment that they were when this person was in place. So just some thoughts for you to consider as you go through it. But so when we talk about leadership, let me pull off the chat for just a second right here. Let me pull down the chat. When we talk about what's the goal of a leader, like I talked about earlier, the real goal of leader is change, okay? So most of the time when somebody switches into a new department or something like that, they're looking for things that they can change to make a difference, to improve. Okay, as opposed to simply assuming it and keep on going like it was. So change is about influence. Okay, it means how can I influence someone to actually change, and so that's the purpose of what a leader's role is in the simplest product form, and that's to change the person. And what they look for is, what this person was when they came on board and what it looks like after they've been on board for a while. Did the person make the changes they wanted to make? And you can glean a lot of information as a consultant when you go ask employees about did they change or didn't they change, and what caused them to change and what didn't cause them to change when you're consulting. But change is the primary role of a leader, and that change happens primarily through influence. Now, it can happen through influencing people using power. And power is the primary methodology we use to create influence. So let me kind of bring up a slide here, and I will cover these real briefly with you. These come from a study out of a couple of guys at the University of Michigan. So it's about 25 miles from Brighton, where I'm broadcasting from. These two guys had done some research, and this is pretty significant research back in 1959 about why employees performed for bosses, and what things did those bosses use to influence their employees to make the changes they needed to make to be highly successful. So basically there were two kinds of power bases that were highly successful, particularly when they were used together. And they're in the green up here, and it was called the expert power base and the referent power base. And what I'm not going to go through them deeply, but expert obviously means you know what you're talking about. The employee felt you knew more than they did, or you performed it better than they did. And a lot of times that was associated with education, but not necessarily true. It could be associated with just simply knowledge. Okay, so you didn't have to have a PhD to have that expert power base in the employee's eyes. The other one's called referent power, and this is really another way to put this is likability. Okay, and really that got a little confusing for me. So I found that really what that breaks down to is building trust. And there are some other people who have done research in this area, a guy by the name of Warren Business, who wrote a book called Leaders, and spent some time going over that book. I got a chance to meet him in San Francisco at one of those leadership seminars. And he had some concept that said that if you want people to trust you as a leader, you have to have compassion. You have to care about people. You have to be competent, which is very similar to the expert power base. You have to have congruity. In other words, what you're saying is who you are, and it's real. It's not different. You can't shake your head and say, yes, that's incongruent. Okay. You have to be consistent. You have to be consistent and do things the way you feel they need to be done on an ongoing basis consistently. And what that does is that allows me to predict you as an employee. If I can predict what you're looking for, that makes me a lot more comfortable in doing it for you. Okay, and allows me a chance to succeed a little more. When it's unpredictable or anything can change, like Donald Trump right now is very unpredictable, and you see all the frustration it causes in his people. So that's not a referent person, okay? So there's compassion, there's congruity, there's competence, there's consistency, and there's candor, okay? Honesty, integrity, ethics and morality go along with those issues. So when you put somebody who's really expert and has those other characteristics as reverent power together and exercises those behaviors, those people were seen as inspiring employees to produce at a higher level for a longer period of time than the other approach, which was basically coercive in nature. The belief that the leader can inflict punishment on the subordinate. In other words, they have control. There's no balance of power here. They are totally in control of the employee. And they use a variety of things. Now, that's obviously in red. When somebody is using coercion, that's not a good word. Everybody senses it's not a good word. It can get things done. Some people who have used coercion, who were highly effective leaders, were people like Hitler and Mao Zedong, and people like that who are dictators and control through fear and violence. So that's the ultimate coercion side of it. So you can get things done that way. None of those guys are around anymore, so that's something to think about. As opposed to someone who's not coercive, like Mahatma Gandhi and Mandela and Martin Luther King and people like that, who sustain a legend forever and ever, and change things for people's lives to the better. Now, what you see, other power bases listed there, reward power, legitimate power, and information power, they're in yellow. And they're in yellow because they're neutral. And what that really means is all of those power bases are used by either the coercive power leader or the referent expert power leader. And so they can be used either way. For example, a coercive leader can use the ability to control your rewards that you perceive they have that ability. They can use that very negatively and coercive. They can take your percentage of salary away. They can remove your bonuses. And that's the threat they have with you. As opposed to the expert referent leader, when you combine those two together and they use a reward, they may come down there and randomly give you a night on town for you and your significant other just because they appreciate you. Have nothing to do with your performance. Okay? They know you perform well, but they just randomly come in there and apply $100 to a dinner at your favorite restaurant. And by the way, they happen to know what your favorite restaurant is too, so how about that? Legitimate power has to do with a coercive person using their title or position. And you often hear people, when they speak of looking at leaders who use legitimate power, you often hear them saying when they don't like that leader that, I don't respect the person, but I respect the title. That's where we are with the presidency. People respect the presidency of the United States of America, which is a legitimate power. They don't respect the person holding it right now very much. So there's an example of legitimate power. Now, information power is becoming more and more prominent in our society, and I'll try to close this off here in just a few minutes for you. But information power is the ability of that leader to control your power or your information. And so the expert reverent leader, those are people who will basically provide information that employees need to do their jobs. They share information freely. They pass information down. They open channels of communication that are two-way. Not only do they share information, they seek information from their workforce. They bring people in and sit down with them and say, hey, how has it been going? What do we need to do differently? How could we be better? Okay, and they actively listen to those employees. They truly want that kind of information because they can take that back and make changes, and the employee knows when those changes are made and that they were part of those changes. Obviously, they're going to be more excited about and more inspired to do what that leader asks them to do, not just to do what they ask them to do, but to exceed it, to go beyond the expectations in those areas. We see that in Silicon Valley when they use all of those perks that you read about, and the workspaces and the daycare centers and all that kind of stuff comes from a referent power-based environment, and that's a reward scenario. Okay, so the reward power, the legitimate power, and the information power can either be used extremely negatively, or it can be used extremely positively. So this has to do with the behaviors that employees look at and determine whether or not they're inspired by your leadership. It has to do with how you influence them, and that has to do with the power base that you use to influence them and the power bases that you use to make things happen for them or not happen for them, either way. So that's what I was hoping to get people to come back in here and understand and learn, perhaps after they see this out on the market in the various social media formats I'm going to present it. Perhaps we can get more people wanting to join us, because when you have a forum like this, when you have a guy who has 35 years of leadership development, has been very successful at developing leaders, I consider myself a successful leader. I consider others who have worked for me to be in very successful leadership roles, and I know them to be very successful. And I know the vast majority of them are that expert, referent, power-based leaders, because that's where I came from. Now, was I successful at everyone? No. There are some people I don't think you can make the changes with. And those people you have to allow, you go to the leader, their bosses, and you say, there's nothing I can do to make this change in this person. And when you do that, it's not a comfortable feeling, but it's something you have to address head on. Because a leader who is a coercive leader who uses those rewards and legitimate and information power bases to manage and manipulate and control employees is someone that you do not want to be in there very long. So it requires you to take the time to take them out of the position and help them. You help to fill that position with somebody else who can take a more referent, expert, power-based leadership style and begin to grow the organization effectively. Because in the end, trust me, in the end, and I know leaders don't see this because they get up there and they get all hung up in their strategy, and they get up in a whole bunch of stuff at higher levels. I've seen it time after time and time in organizations where they don't spend enough time down amongst the people who actually get the job done. When we went in and did a power supply chain program for a corporation one time, the vast majority of money saved on that program had to do with employees who were telling us about the purchase of one bolt and one nut. Hundreds of thousands of dollars were saved in just that one area. But it was that group of people who we had created teams to look at these things with that made a difference in just helping to resolve that one issue of centralizing supply on those two products and making a lot more money come back in that organization. And it also made it easier for everybody to get that product, which obviously if you can get your tools, the same tool, faster and easier, you're going to be happier doing your job. So those are some of the things that I feel like, I would like to discuss on this program in the future. We're going to talk about ethics and morality next week, and what employees think about ethics and morality and the role they play. I hope you will pass this information on. If you see it, pass it on to others. Encourage them to watch. It's not very long. It's only 45 minutes here. We're about to cut it off in just a few seconds. And encourage people to come over and look at it on the YouTube site. It'll be in the description of this video and the playlist. It'll be seen as show number 1. Watch this. Then next week, come join us. This time, come in and start chatting and tell us what you think. So I'm not just sitting here providing this, but I will provide some information about ethics and morality at the end of the show. I'm going to try to promote some education at the end of each and every show. So I hope you enjoy this. I hope you find it helpful to you. Please, please pass this on to other people. This is not an attempt to get subscribers or likes or anything else. It is simply trying to get more people exposed at the hourly and mid-level management levels to leadership concepts and behaviors, which in turn will help them collaborate more effectively with their leaders. Employees can turn around and use these same power bases to influence their leaders, and you'll be surprised the impact that will have. It's pretty amazing when you think about it. Okay, until next week, I'll see you at happy hour next week. Please come join me. I hope you enjoyed it. I've enjoyed being with you. Have a great day.